There's a thing that happens to a man when the cold gets deep enough. Not the shivering that stops after a while, and when it stops, you know you're in trouble. No, I mean the thing that happens before that. The moment when your mind starts bargaining. When you start looking at the world differently, at the horse blanket, at the body heat of the animal beside you, at the man sleeping 6 inches away whose name you barely know, and you think, this is what I have. What do I make of it? I've been a lot of things in my life. A cattle hand out of Uvalde, a surveyor's assistant for 2 seasons, a man who wrote things down in a ledger book not because anyone asked him to, but because I have always been afraid of forgetting. Afraid that if I didn't press the moment into ink, it would dissolve the way dreams do, vivid 1 second, gone the next. I was 26 years old when I rode into the Llano Estacado in the January of 1873, and what I saw there, what I learned there, though learned is too clean a word for it, changed the way I understood warmth itself. Not the warmth from fire. The other kind. The kind that doesn't burn, the kind that endures. This is what I wrote down. The cold came in like a debt collector, quiet, certain, and completely without mercy. I remember the exact moment I understood it wasn't going to ease up. We were maybe 4 hours out from the Canadian River, riding west-southwest into a sky that had turned the color of old pewter, and the wind shifted. Just like that. One breath it was pushing at our backs, and the next it was in our faces, carrying something on it, not quite snow, not quite sleet, but some awful combination of both that hit the skin like thrown gravel. Hector Vane, who was riding beside me, pulled his coat up over his chin and said absolutely nothing. Hector never said anything when he was scared. I'd learned that about him in the first week. Some men talked more when fear got into them. Hector went silent as a stone wall. That told me everything I needed to know about how bad it was. My name is James Calloway Prout, and I kept a ledger. I've always kept a ledger. Not a journal. Journals are for men who think their feelings are worth recording. A ledger, columns, observations. Facts set down in ink so they don't get away from me. My mother thought it was peculiar. The men I rode with thought it was worse than peculiar. But I've never been able to stop doing it, so I don't try anymore. The ledger was in my saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth, and even as the temperature dropped and my fingers went from numb to something beyond numb, to that particular absence of sensation that stops feeling like cold and starts feeling like nothing at all, I was composing entries in my head. Day 11, January. Wind shifted west-southwest approx. 2 p.m. Temperature falling hard. Hector quiet. Bad sign. We were part of a survey party, technically. 6 men contracted to map grazing land near the eastern edge of the Llano Estacado for a ranching concern out of San Antonio. 4 of the 6 were experienced plainsmen. Myself and a man named Del Forsyth were not. Del was a cartographer's apprentice, 23 years old, with a way of squinting at the horizon as though it personally offended him. He was somewhere behind us, riding alongside our guide, a half-Cherokee man named Watt who had been hired specifically because he knew this country. Watt knew the country. That much was true. What none of us had accounted for was the country knowing us. By 3 o'clock the ground beneath us had changed. I'd been on the plains long enough to notice when the scrub grass started thinning. It gets shorter, sparser, and the color shifts from brown to a kind of pale yellow that looks almost white in certain light. The Llano was eating us. That's the only way I can describe it. The landscape was consuming us, drawing us inward, and the further we went, the more the temperature dropped, and the more the sky closed overhead like a lid. "We need to make camp," Watt said. He said it quietly, the way a man says something he knows people won't want to hear. Forsyth looked around at the emptiness. "Where?" "Here." "There's nothing here." "That's correct," Watt said. This was the problem. This was the whole entire problem compressed into 3 exchanges. The Llano Estacado, the Staked Plains, is one of the flattest, most featureless expanses of land on the North American continent. There were no trees, No significant rock formations. No draws, no ravines, no natural windbreaks of any meaningful size. There was grass, there was sky, there was wind, and there was the cold that rode the wind like a passenger who'd paid full fare and intended to stay. We had wood. We had a small reserve of it bundled on the pack mule. Not much, maybe enough for 2 fires of reasonable size, maybe 3 smaller ones. We'd been rationing it since day 8 when Watt had first looked at the sky and said, very quietly, "This is going to change." He'd been right, it had changed. I got down off my horse and went to the saddlebag for the ledger. My fingers weren't responding well. I managed to get it open to a fresh page and I wrote slowly and badly because my hands wouldn't cooperate. Wood situation critical, wind dangerous, no shelter, Watt making decisions, follow Watt. That last part I wrote for myself as much as anything. I had a tendency, a bad one, I know, to second-guess people who knew more than I did. It was some kind of reflex, some defensive instinct that kicked in when I felt like I wasn't in control. Watt had been patient with it for 11 days. I was trying to be better. Hector was already pulling the pack mule around, taking stock of what we had. The other 2 experienced men, brothers named Cass and Reuben Doyle, were doing what experienced men do in a crisis, which is move with quiet efficiency and not panic. I watched them and tried to learn from watching, which is the other thing I do when I don't know what else to do. "How much wood?" Watt asked Hector. Hector counted. "Enough for 1 fire tonight." "Maybe." "We don't build one." Forsyth's head snapped up. "I beg your pardon." Watt looked at him with an expression I'd started to recognize, a kind of patience that had calculation underneath it. 1 fire draws attention, and it won't hold through the night anyway. Wind like this will kill it by midnight. "So what do we do?" I asked. Watt looked at me, then at the sky, then back at me. "We do what the Comanche do," he said. I should explain why that sentence hit me the way it did. The Comanche had been in this country long before we had. The Llano Estacado was theirs in a way that I was only beginning to understand, not in the legal sense that white men meant when they said theirs, which was always really about paper and force, but in the deeper sense. They knew it. They had learned it the way you learn a person you love. The moods of it, the cruelties of it, the particular way it could kill you, and the specific ways it could be survived. And they had survived it for generations. In winter, without the kind of firewood supply that our party was already running critically short on. I had never thought much about how they did that. I'm ashamed to say it, but I hadn't. I'd assumed, the way men assume things they've never examined, that they simply suffered through it, or that they had some cache of wood I didn't know about, or that their constitution was somehow different from ours. That last thought, now that I put it into words, shames me the most. But it was there. It was in me, the way a lot of things were in me that I didn't examine closely. "The Comanche," I said, and I pulled my ledger out again. "What is it they do?" Watt looked at the ledger. He had a complicated relationship with my ledger. I think he found it faintly absurd, but he'd also started telling me things that he seemed to want recorded, which suggested some part of him understood what I was doing. "Put that away for now," he said. "Hands need to work." I put it away. "First thing," Watt said, "is you stop fighting the cold." Cass Doyle laughed at that. Not meanly, Cass wasn't mean, but the involuntary laugh of a man who's heard something that sounds like nonsense. "Stop fighting it." "Right." "I mean what I said. Fighting cold costs energy. Energy is heat. You waste your heat fighting, you die faster." Watt was already moving as he talked, going to the horses. "First thing is the horses." What followed over the next 40 minutes was one of the most peculiar and instructive experiences of my 26 years. Watt organized us into a specific configuration, the horses positioned in a rough circle, heads inward, bodies outward. Then he had us construct what I can only describe as a linta made entirely of horse blankets and bodies. The horses themselves, standing close together, generated a significant and surprising amount of heat. I hadn't really understood until that moment how much warmth a large animal produces. You stand between them, Watt explained, demonstrating, pressing himself against the flank of his horse and then the flank of mine. The wind was still there, still hitting us but reduced, deflected by the horses' bodies. Comanche knew horses better than anybody, not just for riding, for living. They used them as windbreaks, I said. I was narrating my own understanding out loud, which Forsyth found irritating but which I couldn't stop doing. Among other things, Watt said. The other things came next. He sent Reuben Doyle, the more agile of the brothers, to gather grass. Not just any grass. Specific grass. The longer, thicker clumps that grew in the slight depressions in the ground where moisture collected. Reuben moved out into the pale scrub and started pulling it up in armfuls, and I watched him. And then I went and did the same because standing still was making me colder faster. The grass, as it turned out, was insulation. Watt showed us how the Comanche used it, stuffed it between layers of clothing, packed into boots, layered between a blanket and the body. The principle was the same as any insulation: trap air, trap warmth. But the execution of it, the specific, practical, earned knowledge of which grass, how much, where to stuff it, that was what the Comanche had spent generations figuring out, and what we would have spent our freezing night not knowing if Watt hadn't been with us. Grass in the boots first, Watt said. Cold comes up from the ground. People forget that. I was sitting on my heels pulling off my left boot and stuffing dried grass into the toe of it, and I was writing in my head, composing the ledger entry, cold ground upward. Insulate feet. Grass, specific, long-stemmed, depression-grown. My feet, when I got the boot back on, were warmer inside of 4 minutes. It was modest. It wasn't the roaring warmth of a fire, but it was real and it was sustained, and standing there in the wind I understood something I hadn't before. Comfort isn't always about heat. Sometimes it's about holding the heat you already have. By the time the light started failing, which it did fast, the winter darkness coming down like a curtain being dropped, we had established what I began to think of as a survival camp, though it looked nothing like any camp I'd ever made or seen. There was no fire. There were 6 men and 6 horses arranged in a specific pattern that broke the wind and pooled warmth. There were blankets layered in a way Watt had showed us, not pulled around shoulders the way I would have done naturally, but arranged in overlapping sections that covered more ground and trapped more air. We were low to the ground, not standing, not sitting upright, but arranged horizontally, bodies pressed together in a way that would have been uncomfortable under any other circumstances, but which, in that cold, felt nothing but rational. Del Forsyth was on my left. I didn't particularly like Forsyth. He was the kind of young man who expressed his intelligence primarily by finding fault with other people's ideas, and he'd been doing it for 11 days, and I was tired of it. But that night his body heat was against my left side, and I was grateful for it in a way that stripped everything else away. In the cold, stripped down to the basic facts of survival, I didn't dislike him or like him. He was warm. I was warm. That was the whole of it. I don't understand how they did this with families, Forsyth said. His voice was muffled against his coat collar. Children, old people. Better than we're doing it, Watt said from somewhere to my right. But how? They learned it the way everything gets learned, Watt said. The hard way, and then they taught it so the next ones didn't have to learn it hard again. I lay there in the dark, between 2 men I barely knew, feeling the warmth of horses radiating against my back through 2 wool blankets and a layer of packed grass, and I thought about that. The hard way, and then they taught it. I had been on the plains 11 days. I was cold and tired and my fingers ached, but I was beginning to understand, going to freeze to death. Because someone had learned how not to, and had passed that learning on, and it had traveled through generations and arrived, by some improbable route, in the person of a half-Cherokee guide named Watt, riding with a survey party on the Llano Estacado in January of 1873. I found my ledger in the dark. I couldn't write in it, but I held it. That felt like something. The wind went on all night, throwing itself against nothing in particular, finding nothing to break against. We were low and still and quiet, and we were, against all of the night's insistence otherwise, warm. Not fire-warm. The other kind. I lay there until I felt Hector's breathing slow and deepen beside me, and Forsyth's shoulders unknot, the particular relaxation that comes just before sleep, and the Doyle brothers, already experienced, already gone under. And Watt, somewhere on the other side of the horse ring, breathing slowly and steadily, the way a man breathes when he is calm because he knows something that the situation cannot take from him. That knowledge, that was the thing. I thought about what it meant to carry knowledge in your body the way Watt carried it, not in a ledger, in your hands, your habits, your choices. The Comanche had known this cold. They had not just endured it, they had built a way of living inside it, had mapped its edges and found its yieldings, had turned what could kill them into something that could be managed. I did not yet know, lying there in the January dark, that tomorrow would be worse. I did not yet know that the hard way had not yet finished teaching me. I held the ledger, and I let the cold do what it was going to do, and somewhere inside the horse ring the warmth held, thin and steady and real. And that was the first night. By the morning of the second day, the storm had turned theological. I mean that it had become the kind of weather that makes a man reconsider his assumptions about the universe, about what it owes him, about what he is owed by virtue of being alive and upright and trying his best. The answer, in case you're curious, is nothing. The Llano Estacado in January owes a man precisely nothing. It will kill him if he lets it, or it will not, depending on 100 small decisions and 1 or 2 large ones, and it will register no opinion either way. I wrote that in the ledger at first light. My handwriting was bad. The cold had gotten into my right hand during the night despite everything, cramping the tendons in a way that made holding the pen a project, but I got it down. I always get it down. Watt was already up when I came properly awake. He was standing at the edge of the horse ring, looking west, and there was something in his posture that I had started to learn to read over the past 12 days. He stood differently when things were serious versus when they were merely difficult. This was the serious posture, weight centered, both feet planted, chin slightly down, jaw slightly set. I went to stand beside him. "How far to anything?" I asked. "Far? How far is far?" He turned and looked at me. In 12 days I had not been able to determine exactly how old Watt was. There was something ageless about him in the way that some people are, a quality of having arrived at a relationship with time that made the question feel irrelevant. "Too far for today," he said. "Maybe tomorrow if this breaks." I opened the ledger. I wrote day 12, storm not abated, distance to shelter unknown, if is doing a lot of work. Hector Vane had a problem I discovered around the 3rd hour of daylight. It started with the way he was holding his right hand. I noticed it when we were redistributing the dried grass insulation, repacking where it had settled overnight, and Hector was using his left hand for everything. He would do it smoothly, without comment, the way a person does when they're hoping you won't notice something. I notice things. It's the ledger habit. You start recording the world, and you start seeing it more closely. Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe I record because I can't stop seeing. "Hector," I said, "show me your right hand." He looked at me with an expression that said he'd been hoping to avoid exactly this conversation. Then he pulled the hand out of where it was tucked under his arm and held it out. The fingers were wrong. Not dramatically, not black, not gone, nothing that dramatic yet, but the color was off, and the swelling was visible even through the morning light, even through the glove, the shape of the fingers subtly distorted. "How long?" I asked. "Since maybe 2 in the morning." "Watt," I called. Watt came and looked. His expression didn't change, which was somehow more alarming than if it had. He took Hector's hand between both of his and held it, feeling, and then he said, not yet serious, but becoming. "What do we do?" I asked. "I need a volunteer," Watt said. What Watt explained next was something he said came from watching Comanche practices. Specifically, the way they treated cold-damaged extremities in the field, far from any medicine, far from any warmth source. It was simple in the way that the most effective solutions are always simple. You use body heat. Not water, not fire, not any external source. Body heat from another person, applied directly and sustained. Core warmth, Watt said. The body can keep a limb alive if the core is warm. Someone with good core warmth shares it. He was looking at me when he said it. Not specifically, he was talking to all of us, but he was looking at me. I said, all right. What followed was a strange and oddly intimate hour. I sat against the flank of my horse, which was itself the warmest available external object, and Hector sat between my legs with his back against my chest, and his right hand was pressed between my two hands and held against my stomach, inside both our coats, skin to skin. It was absurd in the way that survival situations often are. Two men who were not friends, who had never touched one another in 14 days of riding together, pressed together in the cold like something from a painting of shipwreck survivors. Hector said, after about 20 minutes of silence, "You don't have to stay there." "I know I don't." I know what you mean, Hector." Silence. The wind moved around us. My horse's flank was warm against my back. "My wife is going to think this is funny," Hector said, and there was something in his voice that was trying to be a joke and not quite making it. "Your wife is going to think you survived," I said, "which is what matters." He didn't say anything to that, but his shoulders, which had been rigid, came down a fraction, just a fraction, and I felt it because we were pressed that close. I thought about body heat, about the way warmth travels through skin, through cloth, through proximity. The Comanche had known something so basic about human bodies that I, a man who prided himself on observation and recording and knowing things, had simply never thought to think about it. That warmth is transferable, that it moves from one person to another and keeps both people alive while it does. I put that in the ledger later, warmth as gift, not diminished by giving. Principle of thermal transfer applied to survival, body heat shared does not have but holds. Cass Doyle brought us dried grass to reinforce the insulation around Hector's hand. He did it without being asked, without commentary, just appeared and packed it carefully around our joined hands, and then went back to what he'd been doing. That small thing, that unprompted, quiet act stayed with me. I still think about it. By midday, the storm had not broken. Watt gathered us and said very clearly that we had two choices. We could stay where we were and wait for the weather to shift, which might be today or might not be, or we could move. "Move where?" Forsyth asked. "There is a feature," Watt said, and he paused there, which was unusual for him. "A place the Comanche used, not far, maybe 2 hours in this wind, maybe 3. "What kind of feature?" "Low, protected. They used it for exactly this." "How do you know about it?" Cass Doyle asked, not suspiciously, just as a man asking a question. Watt looked at him. "A man told me," he said. "A Comanche man a long time ago." He paused again. "I did him a service, he told me things." The way he said he told me things closed a door. I recognized the sound of a door closing in a conversation, and I did not try it. I wrote in the ledger, Watt, knowledge as gift given for service. Comanche information transferred by specific relationship. Relationship transaction. We decided to move. Getting Hector on his horse one-handed required effort and ingenuity, and a lot of quiet cursing from Hector, who was not naturally a profane man but who was, I was learning, capable of remarkable creativity under the right conditions. We got him up. Cass rode close on his right side, ready, for the whole 2.5 hours it took to get to where Watt was taking us. The feature, when we reached it, was not what I expected. I had imagined foolishly I now see something dramatic. A canyon edge, maybe. A significant rock formation. Some visible geographical reason why this place would offer protection. What it was in reality was a depression. A broad, shallow bowl in the earth, barely 10 feet lower than the surrounding plain, maybe 40 feet across. The kind of thing you could ride past and not notice if you weren't looking for it specifically. In it, out of the direct path of the wind, the difference was extraordinary. I stepped down into it, and the wind, not gone, but reduced so dramatically it felt like silence, and the cold that came with it dropped by what felt like 10 degrees in the span of 3 steps. I stood at the bottom of the bowl and looked up at the rim and watched the grass on the rim bending and shaking in the wind that was still very much there, still very much hostile, and I was standing in something close to stillness. "How did they find this?" I said, not to anyone in particular. "They looked," Watts said. "They looked until they knew the ground the way you know a room you've lived in for years. Every low place, every shelter, every place the wind doesn't reach." That, I think, was the second lesson, and it was a harder one than the first, though it was quieter. The first lesson had been about what you did with what you had: grass, horses, body heat, arrangement. The second lesson was about time, about the kind of knowing that only comes from sustained attention, from years of looking, from generations of people adding their knowledge to what the previous generation learned. The Comanche hadn't discovered that depression by accident, or not only by accident. They had found it the way you find everything on the open plains, by being there long enough, in enough different kinds of weather, with enough need to notice. We could not have found it without Watt. Watt could not have found it without the man who told him. And the man who told him could not have known it without the generations before him who had looked and suffered, and added what they learned to the body of knowledge that would keep the next person from suffering quite so much. It was a library, I thought, the kind you carry in your body. We made a kind of camp in the bowl that afternoon that was almost, not quite, but almost comfortable. Watt found something else in the depression, a cache of materials, old but present, some kind of dried plant material that I did not recognize, compressed and bundled. Buffalo chips, dried dung, which burns clean and hot, and which the Comanche and the Plains tribes generally had used as fuel for precisely as long as wood was unavailable, which on the treeless llano was always. We had a fire that night. Small, carefully managed, fed with buffalo chips and a fraction of our remaining wood, producing more warmth per unit than I would have believed. Watt showed us how the Comanche managed the heat of it, directed inward, toward the group, bounced off arranged blankets and bodies, the smoke channeled upward and outward by the shape of the depression itself. It was engineering. That was the word that came to me, lying there watching the fire, not primitive survival, engineering. A system developed over generations of trial and error and necessity, refined and improved and passed forward, as sophisticated in its way as anything I had seen built from timber and iron. I thought about what that word had cost me coming to it. I thought about what I had assumed, riding into this country, about the people who lived in it. And I felt, with a clarity that the cold seemed to sharpen rather than dull, the exact dimension of my ignorance. Ledger entry, day 12 evening. I have been recording. I have not been understanding. These are different activities. I was confused about which one I was doing. Hector's hand was better. Not well, not fixed, but the color had returned and the swelling had not progressed. And when Watt examined it in the firelight, he said, in his characteristically minimal way, "Good." Hector looked at me across the fire. He had a look on his face that I recognized because I felt something like it. The look of a man who has been helped by someone and doesn't quite know what to do with it. It's a particular face. I've worn it enough to know it. He said, "Jim," and then he didn't say anything else. "I know," I said. We ate from what we had: salt beef, hard biscuit, the last of the coffee, which Watt heated over the buffalo chip fire and which tasted, in that bowl in the middle of the Llano Estacado, like the finest thing I had ever had the privilege of putting in my mouth. The night came down again. The fire held. The bowl held the warmth, and the warmth held us. Del Forsyth, to his credit, and I want it on record that I give him credit for this, did not say anything critical or clever for the entire evening. He sat and he was warm and he looked at the small fire and he was, for once, simply present. I wrote in the ledger until I couldn't see the page anymore. I wrote about warmth as engineering, about knowledge as inheritance, about the way the Comanche had built a system for survival so complete and so refined that it could save 6 strangers who hadn't known to look for it. I wrote about Hector's hand. I wrote about the man who had told Watt about this place, and the service Watt had done for him, and the way that information had traveled, not through paper, not through ledgers like mine, but through relationship, through obligation, through the specific and personal act of one human being telling another human being something important. Then I wrote, the ledger is a tool. The tool is not the thing. The thing is the knowing, and the knowing lives in people first. And then I slept, in the bowl in the Llano, with the buffalo chip fire dying to coals and the wind going on above us, finding nothing to break against. The storm broke on the morning of the 3rd day with the particular suddenness that weather on the plains is capable of, here one moment, gone the next, as if it had somewhere more important to be. I came awake to a light I hadn't seen in 2 days, the flat, particular brightness of January sun on open country, cutting low and sharp from the southeast. The bowl around us had ice in it, a thin shell of it over the grass at the edges, and everything was very still, and the temperature was still cold but had shifted from the killing kind to the merely unpleasant kind. I sat up and recorded that in the ledger before I did anything else. I can't explain why. It's just what I do. The rest of the men were in various states of waking up around me. Cass Doyle was already standing, looking at the sky with an expression of relief so profound it was almost embarrassing to witness, a rawness of feeling that he normally kept better covered. Reuben was tending to the horses, running his hands over their legs with that efficient, caring way he had. Hector was flexing his right hand slowly, carefully, testing it. Watt was gone. Not gone. I should not have written that even in my head. He was simply not in the bowl. I found him on the rim, standing in the morning light looking west. I climbed up to him and stood beside him and looked at what he was looking at, which was the Llano Estacado stretching away in every direction, flat, pale, enormous, and in the morning light after the storm not frightening but somehow beautiful, though it had spent 2 days trying to kill us. There, Watt said, pointing. Maybe half a mile away, a stand of cattle was moving. Not ours, wild cattle, or someone's escaped stock. Moving in that slow, purposeful way that animals move when conditions have just improved. Not hurried, not panicked, simply getting on with the business of being alive now that the business of surviving the immediate crisis was concluded. How far to the Canadian? I asked. 5-6 hours, normal pace. Can Hector manage it? If he keeps the hands sheltered. Yes. I looked at the cattle and I thought about what we were going to do. Get on our horses and ride out of the bowl and cross the Llano to the river, and then, eventually, back to civilization, which had fires and walls and roofs and all the ordinary apparatus of warmth that I had never once in my life thought to be grateful for. What? I said. He waited. The man who told you about this place. A pause, yes. Where is he now? Watt was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he said, dead, 12-13 years now. I did not ask how. It was not my question to ask, and the way he said it closed that particular door. What was the service? I asked instead, if you want to say. Another pause. His son, Watt said, 12 years old, riding alone. I found him in the break country, 3 days from water, horse lame. I brought him in. You brought the boy back? To his father, yes. And his father told you about this place? Among other things, we talked for a time. He wanted to talk. He told me things he wanted to make sure somebody knew. A pause. He understood something was ending, that things were going to be lost. Watt's jaw moved slightly, the way a man's jaw moves when he's controlling something. He wanted to give it to someone who could carry it. I stood with that for a moment. He had known. The man who had told Watt had known that the world his people had built their survival in was closing around them, that the knowledge his people had accumulated over generations about this land and its cold and its hidden shelters and its particular yieldings was going to have nowhere to live, that the Llano would go on being cold, that the depressions would still hold warmth, but the people who knew how to use them would not be there. So he had given what he knew to the man who had brought his son home. I thought about what it meant to choose your recipient carefully, to look at the person in front of you and say, "You're the one, you'll carry this," and then to hand it over. I opened the ledger. My handwriting was better this morning. The cold had loosened enough that my hand was working properly again. I wrote slowly and deliberately. The Comanche man whose name I do not know told Watt. Watt told us. It saved us Hector's hand, all of our lives in the bowl. One man's knowledge, given as a specific gift to a specific person in exchange for a specific act, traveled across years and arrived here to keep 6 strangers alive in a storm. This is what knowledge is for. This is why you carry it, not for yourself. Getting Hector on his horse was easier that morning. He'd slept with the hand against his stomach, and the night's warmth, the managed, husbanded, deliberately preserved warmth from the coals in the bowl and the 6 bodies, had brought the hand further back toward functional. He mounted unaided. He held the reins with both hands. I watched him do it, and I felt something I can't precisely name, which is unusual for me because I normally name everything I feel. I put it in the ledger as relief adjacent. Del Forsyth came up beside me as we began to move out of the bowl. "You're writing in that thing again," he said. "Always," I said. He looked at it with that squinting expression. "What are you going to do with it?" "I don't know yet." Seems like an awful lot of effort for something you don't know the purpose of. I thought about that. The purpose is so that it doesn't disappear, I said. What happened, what I learned, so it's somewhere. Forsyth looked at the ledger and then at the Llano and then back forward, that squint permanently engaged. "Seems like a lot to trust to ink," he said, and rode ahead. I thought about that for the next 2 hours. Forsyth was not wrong exactly. Ink fades, paper rots, ledgers get lost. The Comanche had not kept their survival knowledge in ledgers, and it had lasted generations, carried in the bodies and habits and taught practices of people who learned it young and lived it daily. My ink was, in that sense, a thin container for the things I'd witnessed. But it was what I had, and the man whose name I did not know had understood something about containers, that the right container matters less than the act of transfer. He had used what was available. A conversation late in the break country between a man who knew something was ending and a man who had brought his son home. I used a ledger. Both of us were trying to keep something from disappearing. We rode northeast through the morning. The sun climbed and the temperature climbed with it, and the plains, in the bright aftermath of the storm, looked almost gentle. That's the thing about the Llano. In good conditions, it is beautiful in a way that is hard to explain to anyone who hasn't seen it, flat and vast and silent and full of sky. And the light on the pale grass doing something complicated that makes you want to stand still and look at it. I wanted to stand still and look at it. I didn't. We had ground to cover. Around noon we crossed a creek. Barely running, I sedged, and Reuben found tracks where the creek bent, wide, padded prints in the mud at the water's edge. "Mountain lion?" Cass asked. "Older than the storm," Watt said, crouching over them. 2 days at least. He looked up and scanned the brush along the creek bank with the specific, practiced look I had started to identify as Watt reading landscape the way I read text. Not following. Passing through. Like us, Hector said. Like everything, Watt said and stood. We watered the horses. Hector held his right hand in the creek for a few seconds. The cold water, Watt had told him, would tell us more about what the hand had. He pulled it out and shook it and said, very quietly, I can feel that. And there was something in his voice that closed his eyes for a second. I looked away. Some moments are private even in close company. I let Hector have that one. We made the Canadian just as the afternoon light started going gold and horizontal. That long prairie light that turns everything amber and makes the shadows run out 100 feet. Cass Doyle, who had been quiet all day, that relief he'd let show in the morning had been put away again, locked back in the chest where he kept most of his feelings, said, as we came down to the river, I'd like to make a real fire. We all would, Reuben said. I mean a proper one, with wood, significant fire. I know what you mean, Cass. Watt found us cottonwood along the river, actual trees, actual branches, the kind of wood we hadn't had for 3 days. Cass and Reuben gathered it with an enthusiasm that I found slightly comic and also completely understandable. I did not gather wood. I sat down on a rock at the river's edge, and I opened the ledger and I wrote, for the better part of an hour, while the fire grew behind me and the smell of wood smoke hit the air, and the men made the specific sounds of 6 people who have survived something and are beginning to process the fact. I wrote about the depression in the earth and what it had held. I wrote about the buffalo chips and what they had proven. I wrote about Hector's hand and the hour of contact and the warmth that had traveled from my core to his fingers and pulled them back. I wrote about the man whose name I did not know, who had told Watt, who had told us. I wrote about what it meant to carry something long enough that it outlasted you. Watt came and sat beside me. He had a tin cup of coffee, and he handed it to me, and I took it. You've been writing all day, he said. I have. What are you going to do with it? It was the same question Forsyth had asked, but different. Forsyth had asked it dismissively. Watt asked it as a real question. I want people to know, I said, about the depression, about the grass, about the body heat and how it works, about your friend's father. Watt was quiet for a moment. Then, he wasn't my friend. What was he? A man who trusted me with something. I looked at the ledger. That's better than a friend sometimes, I said. Watt considered that. Yes, he said, sometimes it is. I want people to know he existed, I said. Not his name, you don't know it yourself, but that he existed. That he looked at what was happening around him and he said, this is going to be lost unless someone keeps it, and he chose to give it to the one person he thought would carry it. Watt looked at the fire. In the firelight his face was harder to read than usual, which was saying something. He would have liked knowing that, he said finally. Do you think he didn't know it? Watt thought about that for a long time. No, he said slowly. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. He was very clear about it, he said. Watt stopped. Tell me what he said. A long pause. The fire popped. The river moved beside us, cold and indifferent, going east. He said that the cold would come back every year, that the Llano didn't care who was there. That what mattered was whether somebody still knew how to live in it. Watt turned his cup in his hands. He said the knowing was the thing, not the people, the knowing. I wrote it down, exactly as he said it, every word. Then I looked up at the fire and at the men around it, at Hector holding his returned hand toward the warmth, at Cass and Reuben talking in the low, easy way of brothers who have been through something together, at Forsyth drawing something in the dirt with a stick, mapping the route maybe, or just thinking, the way he thought with his hands. 6 men around a proper fire on the Canadian River. Alive because someone had known how. The walk back to the survey party's base camp took another 2 days, and they were easier days. The weather held. We had wood when we needed it. Hector's hand continued to improve with each morning. By the time we rode into the camp at Tascosa, his grip was nearly back. He shook my hand when we parted out, right hand firm. I wrote it down. I wrote Hector Vane, right hand returned. I kept the ledger, I have it still. What is in it? The cold, the depression, the buffalo chips, the body heat and the borrowed warmth. The name I never got to write because it was never given to me. All of it is in there in ink that has held up better than I expected, in handwriting that gets worse when I was cold and better when I was not, in the particular cramped script of a man writing as fast as he can because he is afraid of forgetting. Afraid that if he doesn't press the moment into ink, it will dissolve. But here is the thing I didn't understand in January of 1873, in the bowl in the Llano, that I think I understand now. The ink is not what holds it. I've told what was in the ledger to more people than I've shown the ledger to. I told it to my brother, who told it to his sons. I told it to a school teacher in Uvalde who put pieces of it in a lesson about the Plains peoples that I hope she's still giving. I told it to a man on a train to Fort Worth who'd been in the surveying business himself, and who listened with the particular attention of someone who recognizes real experience when they hear it. The ledger is a tool. The knowing is what travels. What the Comanche understood, what the man whose name I don't know understood well enough to choose Watt specifically, deliberately, because Watt would carry it, was that warmth is not generated in a vacuum. It passes. It moves from body to body, from person to person, from one generation to the next, through conversation and demonstration and the specific act of one human being saying to another, "Let me show you how not to freeze." The Llano doesn't care. January doesn't care. The cold returns every year with no interest in who is there to meet it. What matters is whether someone still knows how to live in it. That man knew. He gave it to Watt. Watt gave it to me.